Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Zbigniew Brzezinski and his latest book, Strategic Vision. In it, the former National Security Advisor presents his foreign policy recommendations to restore U.S. status around the world in a post-Iraq War era. He talks with National Journal Chief Correspondent Michael Hirsch.
Dr. Brzezinski, welcome to Afterwards. In your book, The Grand Chessboard, published in 1998, which was very well received, you wrote that America is not only the first as well as the only truly global superpower. You wrote that it's also likely to be the very last. Is this book in some way, your current book, Strategic Vision, a sequel to that earlier book, in the sense that we now have what you call a crisis of global power in your subtitle?
Unavoidably, it is. And to be perfectly frank, I thought that America might be the last, but it would last longer before it became the last. I think it's now clear that we're moving into an age in which, in part, because of our missteps, but in a larger measure, because of the changing character of the global condition, the world is no longer susceptible to domination by a single power.
Yeah. In this book, you talk about the broad shift away from a 500-year-long period of domination of the Atlantic powers, starting with Europe, sort of ending on the other side of the pond with the United States, a shift toward Asia and the end of the era of the West's global supremacy. And you talk about the need to, quote unquote, enlarge the concept of the West as a way of ameliorating the effects of this change. Can you elaborate on that and what you mean when you say that if we don't follow such a policy, dire consequences could ensue?
It's not only a question of power, it's also a question of philosophical, ethical, moral content. If we are to have a world in which people eventually manage to cooperate, to self-govern themselves on a global scale, we have to have a world in which there is, to some significant degree, a universal political culture. And I do believe that the West, for all of its historical shortcomings, and I'm scathing in my book in discussing these shortcomings, because they have to be admitted. For all of these shortcomings, the West still today represents the most acceptable and workable, universally workable political culture, which is respect for others, self-determination, constitutionalism, respect of law, acceptance of certain basic rules based on certain universal predispositions towards what is good and what is bad. That is the central message of the West, in addition, of course, to technological initiative, innovation, preeminence, in some respects, power. So my argument is that the West, to maintain itself, to preserve what is valuable about it, has to play an eminent role, that role is justified by the globe's need for the West, but that the West, to perform it well, also has to become broader, wider, and embrace others that are today not yet part of the West. And I specifically focus very much not only on the American-European relationship as the hardcore of the West, but on the shared need, both of Europe and of America, to partake in that enlargement through inclusion, co-optation, in time, not instantly, I have no illusions about this, of both Russia and Turkey into the West, and maybe some adjoining countries in between. That is part of the strategic message. And of course, the other part of the strategic message in the book is how the United States and the West, but particularly the United States, should manage its relationship with the other half of the world, which for some time to come is likely to be centered preeminently in the Far East and to some extent in Southwest Asia.
Let's talk about that in a moment, but I'd like to hone in a little bit more on this question of the West and enlarging what that is. During the Cold War period, the West was more or less a concrete thing. You had NATO, you had formal alliances, defense treaties. Do you mean that the West should be enlarged in this sense, as some sort of an alliance structure or a power block, or is it much more of a conceptual expansion of value systems that you're referring to?
No, it's something else altogether. In a sense, it's all of the things that you mentioned in the beginning, but it doesn't have to be just one of them. In other words, I don't envisage the West necessarily being composed of everybody being in NATO, but I do think that NATO is needed. So some parts of the West can be united in an organization that enhances security and gives recognition to the importance of security. You can have a West which is simultaneously based on enlargement of financial and economic arrangements. But again, not necessarily to the same degree to all parts of the West.
Right.
Think of the Eurozone and think of the other members of the European Union that are not in the Eurozone. They're still both in the West.
Right.
And so forth.
Would that include potentially, say, Russia as a part of NATO?
Well, I've explicitly said that I don't exclude that. I don't expect that to be soon. And you may have a lot of steps in between. Eventually, sure, if Russia wants to be part of a larger security system, fine. But without it being spelled out necessarily in some sort of arbitrary fashion, Russia also has to prove that it's part of the West by meeting these fundamental standards which define the West.
And this should be accomplished, should be promoted with an eye to what's happening in the East, in Asia, to some degree, the rise of China. And here you talk about what you think should be the dual role of the United States in the future. In the West, the U.S. should remain, I suppose, in its role as a promoter and guarantor of greater and broader unity. In the East, you distinguish America's role, saying that we should be the balancer and conciliator between the major powers. Can you explain that a little bit more, why these need to be separate roles?
Because in the case of Europe, we were engaged in 2 world wars, and we had to be engaged in these 2 world wars, because these 2 world wars were still fought on the premise that the victor would dominate the world. And I think it is correct to say, and morally right to say, that the world wouldn't be better off if the victor was Hitlerism or Stalinism. Today, that is no longer the issue. And the East is not going to dominate the world. The danger today, in my view, is that if we do not do the things I say in my book, and I'm thinking of it strategically, the world will succumb to greater and greater turmoil, confusion. The world is now not only composed of competitive states that should be, if possible, cooperative states, it's also composed, and this is a very major historical discontinuity, it is composed now of what I call global political awakening. The population of the world is activated, it's politically conscious, it's politically restless, it's politically resentful, it's historically angry, and therefore it's a much more complicated process. And our role in that setting, and particularly so in the Far East, should be to try to conciliate, but also to balance between the major protagonists without doing what we did in Europe, becoming directly involved in their conflicts.
You have been given a good deal of credit in the last year for your prescience in perceiving that there was this global political awakening on the horizon, because it seems to have been expressed, in the Arab Spring movement. And you talked about that, I believe, in an op-ed piece you did back in 2008.
Yes, and even earlier in some of my books.
But how far do you think that spreads now? Does it spread to China? it could be spreading to Russia even now with what we seem to be seeing as a rebellion against Vladimir Putin's political
I
party.
think it's spreading. It's a universal phenomenon. It's a universal phenomenon which nonetheless manifests itself with differing degrees of intensity in places and other places, depending on historical circumstances and things which stimulate that awakening. But generally speaking, the world is now politically awakened. And in some places, like in Russia right now, we are beginning to see the emergence for the first time of something which can be genuinely called a civic society. That is to say, part of the middle class, currently more the younger people in the middle class than the older in Russia, people who are now to some extent physically comfortable, and people who are now part of the world because of internet, but even more importantly because of travel and education. We don't have that yet in China.
Yeah.
It may come. In fact, I argue in my book that by 2050 it's very likely to have come, maybe even earlier. But it will take more time, in part also because the Chinese government, which has different values and different priorities than the ones I've spoken of, unlike the Soviets, or even unlike Putin, is an intelligent government. It's more sophisticated, it's more skillful, and very important, economically successful.
Well, let's
So
talk.
that creates a greater degree of stability and also continuity and also capacity to resist the process of change.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because you do make a point of contrasting a rising China with the two major powers during the 20th century that you say got caught up in self-delusion about how powerful they were and projecting that power. One was, of course, Nazi Germany, and the other was the Soviet Union.
And excuse me for interrupting, and there was also a third which deluded itself more nicely, but equally wrong-headedly. That is to say, the United States, which proclaimed in the course of the last 20 years that the entire 21st century is ours. It was Clinton who was saying that, George W. Bush was saying that, and we matched that with unilateralism that became self-destructive and self-isolating.
But China, okay, fine. They seem to be very, very cautious in their strategic approach to their economic rise. But isn't it natural, particularly when you have the very rapid rise of a power, that hubris, self-delusion sets in? Perhaps it's too early for China to reach that point, but you do talk quite a bit in your book about the pitfalls of a rising China. So describe that. How long do you think they can remain, as you say, an intelligent rising power?
I'm going to be a little resistant, but I'll respond to you nonetheless, because I fear two tendencies in our view of China today in the United States. One is to demonize them out of concern, and I think we're overdoing that already. And the other one is to take refuge in the assumption that automatically China is going to falter, and kind of quietly say to ourselves, well, it's a challenge, but they're going to wreck themselves. Maybe neither will happen that much, but there's no doubt there is a tendency in China towards triumphalism, which could be self-deceptive. And I argue in the book, cautiously, that Russia may be an example of something that China may be able to avoid for a while and postpone, but nonetheless cannot entirely evade. Namely, in the Soviet Union, you had a self-selecting elite that was perpetuating itself, and over time, because it's an arbitrary elite, maintaining itself in power by force, it is an elite that also suffers a gradual degradation of its quality. I think the Chinese face that danger. They're aware of it. For example, they've already introduced these sort of periodic, systematic, regularized shifts at the top leadership every 4 years. It's very good. That's going to give them more innovation within the leadership. But to the extent that it is self-controlled and arbitrary, it cannot entirely avoid the risks of a gradual decline of quality, because it does eliminate certain sources of innovation, alternative modes of thinking, new ideas, or whatever, dissent even.
And, you know, a number of observers, China observers, experts suggest that there will be some kind of a reckoning, particularly, you know, with their political system in the in the way that you describe, or you know, something worse. But it does seem to, the current policy of China does seem to be, I wouldn't call it humility, because if you talk to various East Asian leaders, the Chinese do seem to like to throw their weight around in a regional way. But it does seem to be rather restrained in terms of projecting themselves as a global power. You in your book, you say that their global calling card, as you term it, is China's extraordinary GDP growth. But again, I wonder, you know, will that last? Right now, we haven't seen too much of an assertion of a China model, and you know, an alternative model to the West, even though one hears the term Beijing Consensus occasionally.
Yeah.
But do you think that, you know, we will see that, though?
Well, we're beginning to see it. I mean, I also cite in my book examples of Chinese triumphalism, of kind of pounding their chest and saying, look how well we're doing and how badly you guys are doing.
Right.
And there's more and more of that, even though Deng Xiaoping very explicitly admonished the Chinese in a formula which I can't exactly recreate, but which contained an admonition to be modest, to be restrained, not to take too much credit, and to be patient. There is still a great deal of patience, but there's also some triumphalism. And that's inherent in that kind of a situation. Nonetheless, look, China has existed as a state for 6,000 years. And for most of its history, it was successful. The last century was extremely bad for China, perhaps the worst, because in addition to occasional internal disarray, which they experienced before, they were humiliated from the outside. That was a culture shock, which they resent to this day bitterly. And if you provoke them, it erupts violently. And because of that, I think the Chinese are going to be very deliberately self-conscious about how well they're doing, how badly they're doing. And maybe they will not make these mistakes, which some of us, at least self-servingly, tend to anticipate, because they think, the thought is that if the Chinese falter, that will kind of relieve us of the blemishes of lack of success.
Let's go back to the question of how the U.S. is or is not managing this crisis of global power, as you term it. At one point in your book, you criticized President Obama because, as you write, he has, quote, failed to speak directly to the American people about America's changing role in the world, its implications and its demands, unquote. Can you explain that criticism and why you think he's failed to do that?
Well, what I meant by it was that he hasn't done it sufficiently, because I do give him credit for several speeches, particularly in the early phase of his presidency, in which he demonstrated, to my view, a great deal of historical acuity, namely a sense of really what is happening in the world, how it is changing. But he hasn't persisted in that, in part because he discovered that the implication of doing it is doing certain things which may be difficult or unpopular, and therefore he has held back. And he faces the additional difficulty that, in my judgment, the American public is so woefully ignorant about the world that this is a monumental task which is far beyond even the president. Yes, the president has to take the lead, but we also have to think very hard about our educational system and our informational system. Because today, and I demonstrate this with a lot of statistics, in fact, the American public is just appallingly ignorant about global geography or global history or international affairs or significant events abroad. Most Americans live in a world in which they're forced, first of all, to make a living, and secondly, in which they escape from the difficulties of struggling into a world not of information, but of entertainment at the lowest level.
But could you elaborate what sort of unpopular things would President Obama or one of his successors, or President Romney or someone else, need to do that they are not now doing to prepare America for this new role in the 21st century?
Well, I think we just talked about it. One is do some of this educational work. But I'm saying if he were to do that, that's not enough. He's got to have a system which encourages a responsiveness to that kind of input from the president, which means an educational system which tells people what the geography of the world is and what geography implies. I have statistics in my book which shows that Americans couldn't, to a significant degree, identify the Pacific Ocean on a map. During the war in Iraq, couldn't find Iraq on a map, and so forth. Couldn't locate New York City in many cases.
Yeah.
And we have an educational system which gives Americans little perception of what the outside world is about, which makes people susceptible to demagogy. For example, after 9/11, the kind of tendency to identify that horrible event totally with the world of Islam is, first of all, wrong factually. Secondly, it's very dangerous and damaging to us. So those are some of the examples of what have to be overcome on a systemic scale, not just by a single individual or even by a presidency, but by a national awareness, particularly through a process of self-awakening, that if we are to live in a world which is increasingly interdependent and in which people are now assertive, not just we, but the rest of the world is assertive, we have to learn how to relate to that world by knowing what it is like and how its problems are our problems and how our problems can be made to be their problems.
Yeah. If America does go into a long-term decline, does not manage its internal problems in the way that you do go into some detail in your book about, what will the consequences be? You talk about a number of, as you call them, geopolitical victims of this process. Can you talk about that a little bit? Who would the biggest victims be?
Well, before I answer that, let me make a general statement. I think if America falters, the result is not a world dominated by the Chinese, but a world that's going to be increasingly chaotic. Because I don't see in the next 20, 30 years any country, even a very successful China, beyond its current success, being able to play the kind of role we thought we could play, we've tried badly to play in the last 20 years. And I don't think that can be undone. The West as a whole can do much more, and that goes back to what we started talking about earlier. But insofar as sort of dealing with the question of imminent threats is concerned, well, there are a certain number of countries at the fault lines between the major powers that will suffer immediately. And I mentioned some of them. Georgia, for example, would be one example. Now, that's not just a small country. It's also a country which provides a major source of independent energy to Europe. So there are major consequences geopolitically if it falters, if it's deprived of its independence. If Ukraine gets seduced by Russia, Russia itself will move to the West much more slowly, and what I envisage will be less likely to take place.
And this
South
would happen.
Korea.
This would happen as a process of Russia sort of filling the power vacuum.
Well, it depends. You know, South Korea, that could be China and North Korea. Taking advantage of the resulting uncertainties. It could be any number of other countries. It could be eventually even Israel, if we are pushed out of the Middle East, in part because of our own mistakes. And if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict goes on, but the United States is out of the picture, what are the prospects, long-term security prospects for Israel? Big question mark, but not a very hopeful prospect. So these are some of the uncertainties that would arise for countries that I call the endangered, not species, but endangered states.
Yeah. How much will military power be part of the equation, particularly when it comes to Asia? A number of us journalists have spoken to administration officials recently about what is described as a reorientation of U.S. power toward the Asia-Pacific with an eye to a rising China in the wake of the withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan. I think President Obama sees this as something of a corrective to too much focus and too much application of U.S. resources to the Middle East. And there is some evidence that there's even something of an arms race going on between the U.S. and China, and a very much of a changing role for what has traditionally been the projection of U.S. power in the Asia-Pacific, the South China Sea, where U.S. carriers are now vulnerable to the increasingly impressive technology, Chinese ballistic missiles, and so forth. So it's a very complex picture. Can you sort it out a little bit? I know you do address it in your book.
Well, let me first of all say that while I do think an American engagement in the Far East, across the Pacific, is a natural thing for us to undertake, I do not think that the way to define it is to somehow or other relate its greater significance for us to the declining military role of the United States in Southwest Asia, specifically Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't think it's particularly effective or persuasive to even illustrate it by announcing that we're going to deploy 500 Marines in Australia. I find that to be, frankly, on the verge of absurdity. What it would imply in a larger sense, I also disagree with, because it would imply, if we were really serious about it, that we're going to do in Asia what we did in Europe. And in our earlier discussion, I drew a difference between what we had to do in Europe with what is today needed in the Far East, because we're not going to dominate the Far East. Let's not kid ourselves. And we don't need to engage in some sort of a Cold War with China. If we're smart, China needs us, just as we need China. We will do much better by doing what Britain did in Europe during the 19th century, which is try to balance between the major Asian powers, hopefully thereby maintaining a situation in which no one sees itself so powerful that it can use force, and that we at the same time do what we can to promote what we help to promote in Europe. We help to promote in Europe Franco-German reconciliation. That in turn led to German-Polish reconciliation. Polish-Russian reconciliation might be next on the agenda. I think we could do a great deal also while protecting Japan and remaining its ally to promote the Japanese-Chinese reconciliation. And the Chinese might welcome that. We can do the same, maybe, between China and India. But the last thing we should be doing is signaling that we're now going to be involved militarily somehow in maintaining an Asian balance among Asian powers that are rising, that are likely to be very nationalistic and could be easily provoked into intense hostility towards us or among each other. And we may even find then an Asia that either relives the tragedies that Europe experienced in the 20th century, or we may find ourselves drawn into conflicts as parties to conflicts on the Asian mainland. And I find it very hard to imagine anything more self-destructive for the United States than that.
Well, from everything I understand, the Pentagon is planning for some kind of military contingencies in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific, air-sea battle.
Well, it depends where and for what. I mean, you know, we are obviously engaged by treaty to the security of Japan. We are committed to freedom of navigation. I don't see the Pentagon planning for a war on the Asian mainland, either involving, let's say, Korea and China and Japan in some fashion, or involving India, Pakistan, and China in some other fashion.
You do say in your book that the U.S. should not allow itself to be drawn into a war, as you're saying here, save for the security treaties with Japan and Korea.
Right.
But what about Taiwan? Because obviously we're still somewhat bound by law. In fact, the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act.
Yes, but I also address specifically that issue in the book. And I say, look, as a matter of common sense, we have to face the fact that we as a country have recognized under President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger the notion that both Taiwan and China say there's only one China. And we also have to face the fact that if we want to have a stable relationship with China, we cannot indefinitely keep arming Taiwan so they can remain separate from China even though at the same time Taiwan is increasing its links with the mainland and vice versa. There is rapidly growing trade, but more important, movement of people, and hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese settling in China on the mainland near Shanghai. And hence, some process of reconciliation between them is likely. And we should not obstruct it. We should, if anything, try to facilitate it. And there are some formulas, which I discuss in more detail in my book, which may make that palatable to everyone concerned. Not just the subordination of Taiwan to China, but an arrangement whereby there is one state, one country, China, so to speak, but different systems.
Are these an extension of the ideas you had when you were Jimmy Carter's national security advisor? Because obviously diplomatic relations were established during your time in office. I mean, do you see this as a natural extension of what happened 30 years ago?
Well, to some extent, when I engaged in the secret negotiations with the Chinese, with Deng Xiaoping personally, on unification, we talked about China, and it's part of the protocols. And I told him, look, don't expect us to abandon Taiwan, which he wanted us to do. Don't expect us to accept your demand that we'll not sell arms to the Taiwanese. We cannot do that, because if we did that, there would be an immediate upheaval in the area. That would not permit a stable relationship between you and us, and it could even draw us into some sort of conflict. Let us accept the principle. That's what I told him. Let us accept the principle that this will be, to some extent, governed by a process of historical change. History will resolve it. And we have already accepted, under our predecessors, Nixon and Kissinger, the notion there's one China. So this will work out, but let's not try to accelerate it to the point that it backfires. But in the long run, why not? And then later on, when I visited China as a private citizen, Deng Xiaoping used the occasion of my visit, quite deliberately, to have himself and me photographed together talking, and he issued a statement which accompanied that photograph to the effect that China henceforth will propagate the notion of one China, two systems, and use that as a basis for resolving its relationship with Hong Kong.
Yes.
And that includes, in effect, a great deal of autonomy for Hong Kong, but the presence of the Chinese army in Hong Kong. I have since then started articulating a point of view, which I have shared with the Chinese on a number of occasions, that ought to evolve into one China, several systems. In other words, China and Hong Kong, one kind of arrangement. China, Macau, another kind of arrangement. China and Taiwan, another kind of arrangement, specifically in that case, excluding the deployment of the Chinese People's Army on Taiwan.
And have they been receptive to this?
Look, reception is a process. As I said earlier to Deng Xiaoping, it's a historical process. And if you have a historical perspective, and they do, and we should. They've existed 6,000 years, we 200 years. And it's going to work out. But if you draw sharp lines or insist on immediate change, neither will work.
Certainly, the one country, two systems model seems to have worked in Hong Kong. It seems as if the Hong Kong economic system has been allowed to persist.
To prosper. And I can envisage, quite literally, in keeping with my formula, one China, several systems.
Let's just talk a little bit more about what the U.S. Should be doing, or is perhaps doing wrong now. You made a reference to the deployment of U.S. Marines in Australia, somewhat dismissively. But as I understand it, I mean, this is part of a very concerted effort at alliance building by the Obama administration in Asia, renewing ties with the Philippines. Even Hillary Clinton's Secretary of State's visit to Myanmar, the first, to that country under its military junta recently, was described to me as part of an effort to build up ties with a circle of countries that have had somewhat rocky relations with China. Now, the Chinese have not reacted too well to this. If you read their, official and semi-official press, they see this as encirclement, even containment. Do you think this is not a wise policy that's being pursued, or do you think that it could be conducted better?
I would say it's an unobjectionable policy, unobjectionable, if it is not vulgarized by wordings which give it connotations which are, in my judgment, not in our interest and probably not implementable. Because I frankly don't think, whatever our intentions are, that we would ever get engaged in a ground war with China, let's say, to defend Burma, Myanmar, or Hanoi, for that matter. And so I see no point in producing mutual aggravation by using words or engaging in symbolic actions that convey wrong intentions, or not the intentions that would really serve our national interests. Because the fact of the matter is, the United States is not going to have the power to be the assertive arbiter of the Far East, the way it could be and was in Europe. We can be a player, but we have to be a player much more sophisticated, much more like Great Britain and Europe in the 19th century. And that's what I argue in my book.
And you think that U.S. administrations could clarify better what they will or would not do in Asia in terms of actions that might be taken outside of the already the binding treaty relations that we have with Japan?
I think we perhaps could have a clearer definition of our strategic objectives and not be stampeded into hasty theorizing about particular, mostly military strategies, offshore hedging and stuff of this sort. And I think we probably will have to ask ourselves, for how long will the Chinese feel comfortable, which they no longer do in any case, with American overflights right on the edge of their territory? How would we like Chinese bombers flying on the edge of California? Nor necessarily with demonstrable naval presence in the immediacy of their key seaports. How would we feel if this was reciprocated? In brief, we have to have a notion that in the changing world, in which it is no longer possible for any one power, us or anybody else, to be traditionally dominant, how do we define a leading role in a more sophisticated and intelligent fashion?
And as the Chinese become more sophisticated at military technology that includes long-range ballistic missiles that can reach as far as 1,700 miles away, apparently right now, as well as cyber warfare, I would think that it would be wise for the U.S. to pull back even more from.
And look, we've learned to do that with the Russians. What I'm saying about us and the Chinese is in no way different from what we have learned in our reciprocal relationship with the Russians. They could destroy almost all American cities in the course of 6 hours. I had to deal with that in my official capacity. I was supposed to be responsible for coordinating if something happened. And we could wipe out all of Russia in 6 hours, and probably more efficiently than they us. And yes, if we continue to maintain the kind of competition that was characteristic of the 20th century, we will end up with the Chinese and us in the same position.
In an arms race where we already may be entering one right now, right?
We may be.
In your book, you talk about the new concept of global systemic rivalry. Explain for me what you mean by that and why that's
Well, it's interesting you should pick that because when I wrote this, I said to myself, in a way, it was a surprise to me when I thought of it. And I said, gee, other people must have thought of this before. And I looked around and I didn't find any indication anyone else did. It was a very simple idea. Namely, today, when you talk about America and China or America and Russia, or whatever, you can produce instantly sleuths of statistics and comparisons in various activities, efficiency, crime, corruption, armaments, per capita incomes, longevity, and so forth. And you have instantly these sort of comparative data which assess progress and standings and rivalries and so forth. And it dawned on me that that was absolutely not the case, even as recently as 150 years ago, maybe even as recently as on the eve of World War I. People were not aware of these dimensions.
Right.
Today we live in a world which is now so interactive that we are comparing ourselves and measuring ourselves very precisely. And in a way, it's a good thing, because this kind of systemic rivalry puts much more emphasis on who has higher, who has lower child mortality.
Right.
What is longevity in respective countries? What are standards of living? What are the levels of education? How is medicine dispersed? And so forth.
Right.
I think it leads to a much more sophisticated notion of competition in a world in which everyone now claims a rightful share
Right.
to a decent life and is keenly aware of its deprivation by watching every day displays of great wealth, self-gratification, extraordinary greed in some parts of the richer world.
Yeah. And less lethal, I guess, in the days compared to, as you say, you know, when empires vied with each other, great powers, it was a question of how much you had in your treasury.
That's
and,
right.
and how good your military prowess was.
That's right.
Now we have entire social systems competing. But I also wonder whether in an era when, as you say, the world is coming together and there is more similarity between political, economic, and social systems, setting aside the Chinese political system, for example, but with the enlargement of the West, whether perhaps not unlike the earlier era when it was just a question of how much you had in your treasury and how good your military was, now it's just a question of how good your education system is.
That's right.
And
incidentally, the Chinese are the first to have produced a global comparative analysis of the leading universities of the world. And they produce once a year a report on the leading 500 universities in the world. And it is a reasonably good report. Without any hesitation, they list the first 20 as being, I think with two exceptions, American.
Yeah.
And they don't posture regarding their own achievements, but they do convey a sense of awareness that these disparities are significant. And I think that's great. And also, incidentally, when you said earlier, well, apart from the Chinese, when you said the system is more or less universal, you know, Shanghai, I think most American businessmen in Shanghai feel that it's not very different from New York City, except if they were, you know, part of the Chinese structure themselves.
Right. So this is another reason why we have to leave antiquated notions of hegemony and military superiority and the old imperial jostling behind us and look at it in a very different way.
Yes, and I don't want to sound as a pacifist, and I've never been accused of that, but maybe that's coming with age. Yes, military superiority, no. Military security, yes. But we have to be very deliberate that what I consider to be my security could be a source of threat to you, and vice versa. And that's the name of the game. And we started moving in that direction already in the 1950s with détente, with concerns about nuclear weapons, with the first efforts to contain the scale of deployments of nuclear weapons. And it has now become more comprehensive.
I would like to hark back to your career a little bit. I mean, you alluded to this question of not having been accused of being a pacifist, and indeed, during the Carter administration, you were seen as the hardliner on the Soviet Union and vying for influence with Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. It was considered one of the...
No, I wasn't vying for influence with him. He was vying for influence.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. But it is interesting that you did take a line that was seen as different from Kissingerian détente, that perhaps was in some ways a precursor to the approach that the Reagan administration later took in raising questions about the viability of the system. You promoted the Helsinki Final Accord, focused on human rights a great deal, and of course the later history of the decline and collapse of the Soviet Union indicates that that was a very significant factor. That as many of these groups in the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe began to embrace human rights, it was the beginning of the end. You know, I'm just curious whether at this date, 3 decades later, you feel that you were vindicated in your views during those early discussions when the Cold War was still going on?
You know, at the risk of sounding self-promoting, I have to say, yes, I do feel that way. I don't think that in any way I deplore the fact that Reagan bought more of my program than of, let's say, Nixon's notions regarding détente. Nixon had a view of a détente which was basically status quo. You keep what you have, we keep what you have, we won't meddle in yours, you don't meddle in ours. My view was totally different. I viewed Stalinism as equally horrible as Hitlerism. And I was always convinced that the Soviet Union had to be transformed or encouraged to disintegrate. And I make no bones of the fact that I favored encouraging the Soviet Union to disintegrate and to help the process along. And the fact that in the end happened peacefully was a great blessing because it avoided a horrible explosion. But I think the world became immediately much more safer with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think global conditions today in the world are such that that kind of competition that we then faced with the Soviets and then earlier with the Nazis is no longer relevant. And therefore we have to have the kind of approach that you and I have been discussing over the last hour.
Because that was my next question. Was there any way in which those experiences that you had when you were National Security Advisor under President Carter informed the thinking in this book? Because it does seem as if the conclusions of this book, as you just suggested, are very different in approach from the hardline approach that you were ascribed to have during the Carter administration.
Well, because I think the nature of the challenge has changed. In the Carter administration, we were facing a Soviet Union which, while buying the notion of a détente based on the division of the spoils, was at the same time proclaiming that it would replace us, that it would push us out of the game, and it would dominate the world. And in that kind of that kind of zero-sum game, I felt that we ought to exploit the advantages that we have and exploit the weaknesses from which they suffer. I think today the issue is no longer whether we will dominate the world or whether the Chinese will dominate the world if we don't. I think the issue is that we can all be consumed by mounting global turmoil, which would unleash the residual forces of hatred and dissent and historical animus that dominate so much of human relations. And therefore we have to be much more intelligent, much more prudent, and to return to our initial discussion, also much more conscious of the importance of propagating successfully but peacefully our values, so that someday we move into a genuinely global community that is based on a shared universal political culture with humanistic overtones.
Another aspect of that is the question of dealing with rising radical Islam, was something that, again, as National Security Advisor, you were witness to in the early days of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, dealing with the ouster of the Shah, and of course we still confront a radicalized and potentially nuclear Iran today, one that could truly upset the balance of power in the Middle East. Can you talk about that a little bit? I know you do address it in your book, about how that should be resolved based on your past experiences.
Well, I think one has to differentiate between the larger issue of Islamic fundamentalism, extremism, or moderation, and the more narrowly confined issue of Iran, although the two are obviously related. In regards to the former, we alluded to it a little bit in our discussion. Namely, I see Islamic extremism as a minority phenomenon in the Islamic world. But it's a big world, So even the minority phenomenon can be of some significance if we're not careful. Therefore, we should be very prudent in not stimulating it. And a kind of black-white confrontation with Islamic fundamentalism, viewed as a shorthand definition of all of Islam, in my judgment, is counterproductive. It also leads to abuse of civil rights of many Muslim Americans in this country, which is something we'll come to regret in years to come, because we have been treating some of them very, very badly. But on the sort of geopolitical level, we have to rather work with the moderate forces in Islam, which are by far the predominant forces in Islam. And that ranges from Morocco all the way to Indonesia. In almost every places, the fundamentalist extremists are a small minority. And it requires, I think, a diplomatic, intelligent approach to prevent them, to stop helping them become the majority. On Iran, we have the precedence of dealing successfully with the Soviet and Chinese nuclear threat, which is far greater and much larger. I don't want the Iranians to have a nuclear bomb, but I don't favor going to war to prevent them from having it. If there has to be a showdown with Iran over Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, once it is evident that they really are acquiring it, because it's still somewhat unclear whether they're seeking it or whether they want to be close to having it, but not getting it. Then if we go to war, we have to do it with others. Absolutely. It's not to be a repetition of Iraq or Afghanistan. If we go to war alone, we'll suffer all of the consequences. And those countries that could wish to be our rivals and in whose animus we have no special interest would take advantage of it. I have in mind Russia, even China, to some extent even India. I think the world would be laughing at us if we got involved in a war with Iran in order to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, when the Iranians have survived 3,000 years. They're an intelligent people. A situation in which even the defense minister of Israel says that the Iranians, the moment they have their first bomb, are not going to attack Israel. And therefore they're not an existential threat. For us to start a war over that would mean to plunge the global economy into a crisis, to engage ourselves in a prolonged new conflict, to the advantage of those who don't wish us well.
What more can be done? There's already evidence that there may be a covert war or a series of covert actions taking place, which the U.S. and Israel together may be to some extent responsible for.
We have to be careful on that, because if we are not careful, we'll fuse Iranian fundamentalism with Iranian nationalism. And it's not in our interest. In our interest is to separate the two. Because eventually, many of the preconditions for a democratic evolution of Iran, of the kind that Turkey has experienced, are there. But we have to pursue a policy which either limits the ability of the fundamentalists to be a threat or encourages even their physical political displacement. If we engage in activities which we wouldn't want others to pursue vis-a-vis us, which means assassinating people, interfering and so forth, we perpetuate the regime and we make it stronger.
Let's talk a little bit more about what's gone wrong with the United States in our closing minutes here, because you do go into some detail about that in your book. And it's interesting, there was another passage from your earlier book, The Grand Chessboard, that came back to me, where you talked about as we become increasingly multicultural as a society in the United States, the more difficult it will be to fashion a consensus on foreign policy, except if there's some really dramatic and massive foreign threat. Well, it's interesting that since then, you wrote that in 1998, I mean, since then we've had 9/11, and yet we have this deep disagreement in this country over the conduct of the 9/11 response to the 9/11 threat, the Iraq War. We seem to have, if anything, a much greater sense of division now than we had when Jimmy Carter was running for president against Ronald Reagan. Talk about how serious you think those problems are, and how do we resolve them?
I don't have recipes for an easy resolution. I think I have identified some of the problems, I hope I have, in the book. I also have tried to identify simultaneously some of the sources of recovery, some of the assets that we have that we could exploit more effectively. And I think drawing on those assets is the way to go. And that brings us back to some of the discussion that we engaged in earlier, namely that a great deal of the problem rests in the fact that America, while globally engaged as a society, is remarkably self-isolated. And we have to overcome that. We have to understand the world better and more clearly. And one of the purposes of this book is not so much as to provide a prescription for domestic solutions, but as to provide a perspective on the world that will be healthier, more historically relevant, and thereby also facilitate some of the needed domestic accommodations. I don't want to exaggerate the potential for that, but I hope the book contributes to it to some extent, because a great deal of the public discussion today in the United States, either about our domestic dilemmas or about our foreign conundrums, reflects extraordinary simplicity of thought, kind of extremist propositions. Get rid of the government, free America from the clutches of Washington and stuff like that. What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean to a poor family whose key members are profoundly ill and has to have some medical care? What does it mean for people who have had jobs for 20 years and are totally displaced and cannot find alternatives? It's not responsive to some of the basic problems of human existence in America. It's a vulgarization of basic social dilemmas.
Do you see it as more vulgarized, more polarized than it was in the late 70s leading up to the era of Ronald Reagan? I mean, obviously there was a very tough fight between Reagan and Carter, very different views of how America...
Yes, but I think there was less of a total cleavage. And the discussion, for all of its shortcomings, because every presidential discussion is a kind of a simplification and generalization, I think was frankly on a higher level than some of the discussion that we have been listening to recently, where everything's presented literally almost in black and white colors. And the president is accused of not being born in the United States or being a crypto-Marxist or a socialist. We didn't have that, even in the sharp debates between Reagan and Carter, or even between McGovern or Nixon, or between Goldwater and Johnson.
In the final moments here, I'd like you to just reflect back a little bit more on your time as National Security Advisor, the Carter administration, how that informs your thinking now. You were involved in the peace process in some ways. You know, the Camp David Accords, which you were part of, were, I guess, the last successful U.S.-led negotiations. And as I understand it, you know, President Carter was very fearful even at Camp David for President Sadat's health.
That's right.
I believe he sent you out at one point in your pajamas to make sure that Sadat was okay.
That's right.
Could you just reflect on that a little bit briefly?
Well, on that specific point, I'll just mention he was concerned that there may be some movement, since Sadat wanted peace, among the more sort of extremist elements within the Egyptian delegation to perhaps do something to him, etc. But the basic lesson that I learned from that, on that specific issue, is that the Palestinian-Israeli problem will never be solved by the Palestinians and the Israelis alone, for different reasons. The Palestinians are weak and divided. The Israelis are strong and entrenched. There is simply no point for a compromise. The weak are too weak to compromise. The strong are too strong to be agreeable to a compromise. So if there is to be a resolution, it has to come from the outside. The only source from the outside is still the United States. But only the United States that is then determined and clear in fashioning what will then become acceptable to the two parties and is reasonably fair in a historical perspective and enduring, and gives justice and self-respect to the Palestinians and self-determination as well, and gives security and self-respect and a permanently constructive role in the Middle East to the Israelis. In fact, in my judgment, if there was peace, an intelligent peace, pushed through by the United States, Israel and Palestine would jointly become the equivalent of Singapore in the Middle East.
Interesting.
Instead, they're destroying each other gradually. In the short run, the Palestinians suffer more. In the longer run, I fear profoundly that Israel will suffer more.
Well, Dr. Brzezinski, thank you so much for sitting down.
Well, thank you for reading my book, first of all. I'm impressed by how much you read.
I know it hasn't actually come out yet, but I'm sure that it will be very well received, like your other books have been, and hopefully, you know, some of your message will make its way to a very polarized Washington, where you know, even any sense of unity on foreign policy seems lost to the political debate as we head into the 2012 presidential season. But thank you.
Well, thank you.